Families, they can be a bit complicated. They can be your best friend, they can be your mortal enemies, they can be a group of ruffians you've acquired over the course of 11 movies and now go on a series of different heists with. But at the very least, most of us have the privilege of knowing who these families are. Whether it be adoptive or biological, the majority of us understand who our family is. Now, this is because children shouldn't be left alone without some semblance of a parent around, and by and large, the real world listens to this rule. But anime doesn't. See, there's a long-standing idea in anime that 12-year-olds should just live by themselves. And 12 is actually pretty old for an anime character being left completely alone. I mean, watch Kotaro Lives Alone. It's a story about a 4-year-old with an apartment. But Kotaro isn't the only anime character to have a question mark around the family category. In fact, the vast majority of characters within Naruto also have question marks around the family category. Whether these characters come from a no-name clan that we never see, like Rock Lee or Tenten, or are raised in obscurity for the vast majority of the show because of their true lineage, like Naruto, multiple members of the Konoha 13, and some of the most important characters in all of Naruto really have nothing so far as identifiable family. And in a lot of circumstances, we're willing to accept that. We don't need to know what Tenten's family looks like, or Rock Lee's, because he has Mike God. But what happens when a character comes from a no-name clan, but is also incredibly powerful? As in Naruto, we know that genes have a lot to do with the power that one acquires. So at that point, people begin to speculate that maybe this no-name clan that this powerful character hails from isn't actually a no-name clan. And that is exactly what happens with Minato on a somewhat daily basis. See, Minato's clan is the Namikaze, a clan we've never heard of outside of Minato. But a lot of people have issue with that, because Minato is one of the strongest characters in the history of Naruto. And therefore, to believe that one of the strongest characters in the history of Naruto came from a clan that doesn't have a second member doesn't really sit well with anybody, especially when you consider the fact that the Namikaze could have stepped in and raised Naruto if they were around. And thus people speculate tons of different theories. Maybe the Namikaze don't exist. Maybe the Namikaze were a made-up name in order to protect Minato from a dirty past. Maybe the Namikaze come from a faraway land, but Minato somehow made it to Konoha. But by far the most possible theory to me is that the Namikaze were a constructed name. Well, not necessarily constructed, but adopted. See, in the Naruto world, strength is largely genetic, especially as it pertains to chakra pool. And considering the fact that Minato had one of the largest chakra pools we've ever seen in Naruto, it's hard not to make the assumption that he didn't come from one of the royal families of Konoha. Which is why today we're gonna be exploring the theory, is Minato Tobirama's grandson? But before we get to exploring anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys like the idea of me exploring anime theories, you're gonna love my other channel, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk about any other anime. And if you just love the idea of me talking about anime, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, that I do every week with Danny Motto, where we break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So the idea of Minato being related to Tobirama isn't one that's talked about very frequently. And this mostly because we've never seen Tobirama actually have a wife. We have no confirmation whether or not Tobirama ever had kids, and Minato doesn't look like Tobirama. I mean, Tobirama looks closer to Kakashi than anything. And we've actually done theory videos explaining how Sakamo Hatake might have actually been Tobirama's son. But I received an email recently asking whether or not I believed it's a possibility that Minato could be a Senju from the descendancy of Tobirama. And honestly, the similarities stacked up too high to ignore. See, the theory that Minato is a Senju is not a new one. However, people have theorized for years that the connection between Minato and the Senju doesn't come by the way of Tobirama, but instead Tsunade, and more specifically by the way of Tsunade and Jiraiya, possibly having a secret child before Tsunade absconded with Dan, and obviously before Dan died. Now, it's also a possibility that this secret child was with Dan. We just don't really know. Guess it all depends on which side of the fan fiction you're reading. Now, many believe this secret child theory is actually corroborated by the Minato one-shot that just came out a couple of weeks ago, at least as it pertains to Minato being Jiraiya and Tsunade's child. Because after Minato battles against Kurama within Kushina's seal, and after Kushina punches through Minato's chest in her version 2 cloak, Minato is brought to the hospital and is healed by Tsunade, and when he wakes up, Tsunade, Kushina, and Jiraiya are all there. Now, many believe that this clear connection between Tsunade and Jiraiya watching over Minato's health is a confirmation of the secret child theory. I would actually rally against that. See, Tsunade and Jiraiya being there when Minato awakes in the hospital just kind of makes sense. Since all of this happened during the Second Great Shinobi World War and before Tsunade lost Dan, she was still healing people. And as Minato had a hole in his chest, the only real person that could heal him was Tsunade. So naturally, Jiraiya, his teacher, would take him to see one of his closest friends, who also happens to be probably the greatest medical ninja alive. So is Tsunade and Jiraiya being there when Minato wakes up in the hospital a confirmation of them being his parents? I don't think so. On top of this, the ages don't line up in a way that makes me comfortable. See, we know how old Minato was and the day he died on. We know that he died at 24, 12 years prior to the beginning of Naruto, because Naruto was 12 at the beginning of Naruto, and Minato dies on Naruto's first day alive, which means that Minato and Kushina would be around 36 to 37 if they had made it to part 1 of Naruto. In part 1 of Naruto, Tsunade is 51, meaning that Tsunade would have had to have Minato somewhere between 13 and 15 years old. The reason I'm giving a spectrum here is because ages are always actually kind of tough to nail down in Naruto. And while that's absolutely a possibility, Tsunade could have had a child at 13 to 15 years old. The idea makes me uncomfortable. However, the rationale between Tsunade and Minato being connected is unfortunately relatively sound. I mean, both Minato and Tsunade have the same colored hair, they have a connection through the Minato one-shot, and they both have insane chakra pools. Not to mention, they both wield Senju techniques, with Tsunade wielding her mitotic regeneration and Minato wielding Flying Thunder God. And since Minato is the only Namikaze, it's a possibility that some Senju down the line adopted the name of Namikaze in order to live up to the Senju ideals of living for the village and not for the clan. Because as we know from my most recent 1010 is a Senju video, the Senju, when they created Konoha, wanted to dissipate into the village to strengthen the village and not the clan itself, the opposite of the Uchiha. Or it could be that a Senju decided to adopt the name of their partner in order to erase the Senju name. Now, obviously, in the circumstance of Tsunade bearing Minato, she would just choose a random name for him in order to make sure that nobody knew that he was her child. Hence the whole secret child theory. And since Tsunade fabricated this name, that explains why there's no other Namikaze. But once again, I believe that Tsunade is too young to have given birth to Minato, and therefore the connection between Minato and the Senju has to lie somewhere else. So where does it lay? Well, ironically, I actually believe that Tsunade is a key in figuring out exactly how Minato is connected to the Senju, as I don't believe Tsunade is Minato's mother, but a second cousin, or a cousin twice removed. Let me explain. See, the reason that Tsunade and Minato have a massive amount of similarities is because lineage-wise, they hail from very similar lines. So the theory that we're explaining today would explain that Minato isn't Tsunade's child, but well, like, I don't really know what it is in family terms. So Tobirama and Hashirama, right? So like they're cousins, but because their grandfathers were brothers. But like you can't be like a grand cousin, so it's either cousin twice removed or second cousin. I think it's second cousin, because twice removed would be through marriage. I have no idea. I don't get why we can't just be grand cousins or great grand cousins. Regardless, if they were in Alabama or Tasmania, they could date. You see, Hashirama wasn't the only legendary Senju, and he wasn't the only Senju Hokage. In fact, because the first data book says that the Shinobi Academy was made 50 years prior to the start of part 1 of Naruto, and we know that Tobirama created the Shinobi Academy while he was Hokage, there's actually a fairly large chance that Tobirama became Hokage before Hashirama's death, as Hashirama wouldn't die until the beginnings of the First Great Shinobi World War, which happened more recently than 50 years ago. And Tobirama dies somewhere in the middle of the First Great Shinobi World War, and maybe even closer to the end of it, with conservative estimates placing him at being Hokage for around at least 5 years. So why only marry one Senju off, especially if the second Senju was going to be democratically elected the Hokage? See, there was 2 individual reasons to marry off Hashirama. 1, in order to show the rest of the clan that they should marry outside of the Senju in order to strengthen Konoha as a whole, and 2, to strengthen the ties to an incredibly powerful clan in the Uzumaki. So I ask you, why stop there? If the plan was always to make Tobirama the next head of the Senju clan, why wouldn't you have him continue to espouse the virtues that Hashirama had? Why wouldn't you have him continue to grow the strength of the bond between the Uzumaki and Konoha? And thus, instead of imposing a secret child theory of Tsunade having a kid at 14, I impose the secret Uzumaki theory, that Tobirama, much like his older brother, also got married off to an Uzumaki clan member, just one that wasn't the Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails, and therefore we never saw. Considering the fact that we only see Hiruzen's wife show up when Obito kills her, Tobirama's wife not making a mainstay in the anime or the manga isn't all that surprising, as Tobirama himself barely makes a mainstay in the manga. I mean, also, look at Tobirama. He is a gorgeous man with probably the best drip out of any of the Hokage. The only excuse for him not marrying somebody and having children is the Kakashi my guy excuse. You know, this isn't how it works. So this theory speculates that Tobirama, just like Hashirama, married an Uzumaki and had a lost generation child. Now, lost generation child refers to the generation between Tobirama and Tsunade, as we know nothing about Jiraiya's parents, Tsunade's parents, Orochimaru's parents, or really anybody from that timeline at all. See, that generation is too young to be considered Hiruzen or Danzo's generation, but too old to be considered the legendary Sannin's generation, and thus it's referred to as the Lost Generation. However, the genetic mix-up of this Lost Generation is insane, as the children that Hashirama and Tobirama would have fostered would have been half Uzumaki and half Senju, which is pretty much the best shake-up genetically you can get. But the reason that this generation is probably lost is because this generation was born into the early days of Ninja Village Foundation, and thus a lot of the children created by Hashirama or Tobirama actually probably didn't become ninja, because at the moment of their birth and for about 20 years after, villages were just focusing on building themselves. It was a relative time of peace. But assuming that Tobirama does foster a lost generation child, it would be that child that would eventually have Minato. But because of the Senju ideals to abandon their name and dissipate into Konoha to strengthen it as a whole, or because Tobirama is a girl dad, the Senju name dissipates and Minato becomes an Amikaze. And both of these are equally valid reasonings, because as we know, the Senju have been killed off or exiled. They've just decided to abandon the name, with Tsunade being the last standing Senju. But having a similar lineage to Tsunade explains the massive amount of similarities between Tsunade and Minato. It also explains the age gap. Now, obviously, Tobirama isn't 13 years younger than Hashirama. That would be insane. But since Tobirama's rise to importance in the Senju clan happened substantially later after Hashirama's, it's a possibility that his political marrying off happened later in life for him than it did for Hashirama, and thus any children he would have sired would have happened 13 to 14 years after Hashirama had his kids. As mind you, Hashirama was Hokage for almost 2 decades. We know this because there's a photo of Hashirama holding Tsunade, which means that he had to be in Konoha for at least 22 years before his death. And we know that both Hashirama and Tobirama had a brother by the name of Itama Senju, who had half blonde and half black hair. Now, Itama is killed during the Warring States period by 5 adult Uchiha. It was overkill. But Itama is really the only connection to blonde hair in the Senju. However, that blonde hair trait popped up in Tsunade, just the same way as it popped up in Minato, which makes sense actually, because the blonde hair trait is recessive and therefore can be carried from generation to generation until eventually it gets a genetic role good enough to actually pop out. And thus you have 2 grandchildren with similar genetic lineages that manifest similar genes at similar times. But Minato's possible relationship to the Senju, and more importantly Tobirama, explains a lot more than just his hair. See, more than anything, Minato possibly being a quarter Senju and a quarter Uzumaki explains his chakra pools. As we know, both the Senju and the Uzumaki are well known for their chakra pools and their life force. Being a quarter Uzumaki and a quarter Senju is basically like being either half Uzumaki or half Senju, which is why Minato is able to spam incredibly chakra exhaustive abilities like Flying Raijin, which, by the way, he's the only other person outside of Tobirama who's ever used the Jutsu, which is actually what spurred this theory in the first place, as it's a possibility that Flying Raijin is actually a hidden Jutsu, a Jutsu passed down through a clan or a bloodline or through an area, kind of like Shadow Paralysis Jutsu or Partial Expansion Jutsu. But the Flying Raijin Jutsu is a jutsu passed down through Tobirama's lineage directly to Minato. To take it even one step further than that, Minato and Tobirama's markings for flying Raijin are all connected, with Minato's markings bearing a left formula and Tobirama's marking a right formula. And because of this, Minato and Tobirama are able to use techniques like, and I'm gonna have to read this, Flying Thunder God Mutually Instantaneous Revolving Technique. Now, obviously one can make the argument that because they're using the same technique, that their seals would be intrinsically similar, but don't we think it's at least a bit suspicious that they were able to link into each other's seals like that? Almost like there was some kind of clan or genetic predisposition that allowed them to collaborate at a higher level. And more than anything, this would actually also explain Naruto's chakra levels. See, for a long time we understood that Naruto has an insane amount of chakra because he's half Uzumaki, which fed us into the ideology that, oh my goodness, I couldn't even imagine what a full Uzumaki would look like chakra-wise because Naruto's got more chakra than Kurama. Does that mean that a full-blooded Uzumaki has double the amount of chakra as Naruto? And while we understand that that way of thinking is incorrect because Kushina had an insane amount of chakra even for the Uzumaki, to attribute the entirety of Naruto's chakra pool only to Kushina never really sat well with me. So you understand that diluting Uzumaki blood actually can nerf the Uzumaki chakra pools pretty substantially, as we've seen with Naruto marrying Hinata and Boruto having a chakra pool that is minuscule in comparison to Naruto, as Naruto, without the help of Kurama, was still able to make hundreds of clones, while Boruto was able to make about 4. And well, obviously, as Boruto grows up, his chakra pool will increase. It's not insane or out of pocket for me to say that Boruto has way less chakra than Naruto did at his peak, or even when he was Boruto's age. And thus, what if the real reason that Naruto got as much chakra as he did isn't just because he had half of Kushina's genetics, but also because he was hailing from another quarter Uzumaki, quarter Senju in Minato, making Naruto actually 3/4 either Senju or Uzumaki. It's a slightly more compelling case for explaining why Naruto was born with equal amounts of chakra to Hashirama and Kushina and other legendary chakra pool ninjas. Well, actually, without Kurama, Naruto has less chakra than Hashirama because with Kurama, he had as much chakra as Hashirama. Hashirama said as much during the 4th Great Shinobi World War. But that kind of corroborates our point, as Hashirama was a full-blooded Senju, and therefore, technically, he should have more chakra than Naruto. But the connections go further than that. I mean, obviously, we have the fact that Minato mastered Flying Thunder God at age 14, which we just found out in Minato's one-shot. Because in Minato's one-shot, it opens with him teleporting himself and 3 other people away from a tailed beast bomb at the age of, at oldest, 14. And considering the fact that Flying Raijin is very much an S-rank jutsu that only ever Minato and Tobirama learned, the fact that he mastered it at the age of at most 14 probably speaks to some kind of genetic advantage. But more than that, we also learned in Minato's one-shot that he was a true master of Fuinjutsu and has been for a long time. Obviously, a large part of the Minato one-shot talks about how Minato trained in Fuinjutsu with Kushina. And while Kushina was obviously incredible at Fuinjutsu and probably a really good teacher, picking up Fuinjutsu and mastering it to the degree that Minato did at, once again, at least 14, also speaks to a genetic predisposition. See, while Kushina was losing control of Kurama and being enveloped in a version 2 Jinchuriki cloak, Minato took one of his hands and jammed it into her 8 trigram seal, at which point he began to augment it to seal away Kurama, like it was easy to do. Mind you, at this point, Kushina has been in the village at most 5 years, which means at most Minato has been training in Fuinjutsu for 5 years. And you expect me to believe that in the course of those 5 years that Minato has learned Fuinjutsu to such a degree that he can actively reseal away Kurama with one hand as Kurama is trying to break out of the seal. But Kurama says something very interesting while Minato is augmenting the 8 trigram seal and sealing him away. And what he says is that Minato is comparable to Hashirama Senju in both his chakra prowess and his Fuinjutsu ability. Now, being compared to the Senju by an entity that has very much had to deal with the Senju for the last couple of decades is interesting. Now, sure, you could just take that as the fact that Minato's Fuinjutsu ability is comparable to that of Hashirama's, but I tend to look at it as Kurama comparing the chakra signatures of the 2 of them, which I think corroborates our theory when you consider the fact that we're saying that Minato hails from Hashirama's brother. Outside of the prospect of Tobirama possibly marrying an Uzumaki, there's also the fact that Tobirama himself created Edo Tensei, which is very much a sealing jutsu. And therefore, even if hypothetically Tobirama didn't marry an Uzumaki for some reason, any progeny of Tobirama would be incredible in Fuinjutsu, as the chops required in Fuinjutsu to quite literally yank a soul out of the Pure Lands and shove it into a conduit and then force that soul into your submission is a lot. But since we are operating under the assumption that Tobirama did marry an Uzumaki, this also explains why Minato was able to operate for a little bit after using the Reaper Death Seal. See, we know that the Reaper Death Seal was created by the Uzumaki, and it's actually theorized that the Uzumaki life force was at such a level that they could use the Reaper Death Seal and survive. As we've seen Uzumaki survive things that should have killed them in the first place, like Mito having Kurama pulled out of her. But evidence-wise, that is a bit thin, because obviously Minato dies right after using the Reaper Death Seal, just not from the Reaper Death Seal. So as to how long he was going to survive after using the Reaper Death Seal, we really can't say. However, the imagery of Minato dying from using an Uzumaki technique does slightly bolster our theory. I mean, sure, once again, you could say that he learned it from Kushina, and that's where the imagery is coming from, but it could also point towards his heritage. But speaking of heritage, a possible connection to the Senju through Minato also explains basically the entirety of the plot of Naruto. See, as we understand, Naruto is a reincarnation of Asura, who obviously has a track record of reincarnating in the Senju. Now, the reason that Asura reincarnates in the Senju is because the Senju come from Asura, just like how the Uchiha come from Indra. Therefore, in order to continue the cycle of hatred and the battle that takes place over thousands of years through multiple different generations of reincarnations, Asura reincarnates in the Senju and Indra reincarnates in the Uchiha. Now, technically, if we don't consider Minato Tobirama's child, there is no connection between the Senju and Naruto. Though that's not the craziest thing, because the Uzumaki are also descendants of Asura, or at least they are said to be closely related to the Senju, which would mean at some point the Uzumaki probably split off from the Senju and did their own thing, which is why they share the life force and the chakra pool of the Senju. And therefore, without the connection to the Senju, Naruto being Asura's reincarnation isn't the craziest thing, but a connection between Naruto and the Senju would bolster the reasoning behind him becoming Asura's reincarnation. But to finish off with a point while we're talking about Asura, we obviously know, and it was very much explained in Minato's one-shot, that Minato created the Rasengan. Now, for those who just watched the anime, you'll believe that Asura was the creator of the Rasengan, because he used the revolving bubble Rasengan attack against Indra. And unfortunately, you are both wrong and right simultaneously. See, it's neither right nor wrong to say that Minato created the Rasengan. It's all a matter of how you look at filler, because obviously Asura creating that Rasengan thing was from filler. If you look at filler through the lens of any filler that gives us information that we weren't previously privy to should be considered canon, then Asura is the person who created the Rasengan. However, if you believe that all filler should be ignored, period, then Asura didn't create the Rasengan. That was Minato. Now, unfortunately for the circumstance of Asura and Minato, it kind of exists somewhere in between those two ideologies. Because yes, Asura and Indra's backstory gives us information that we weren't previously privy to, and thus, I consider it canon to a degree. However, with the release of Minato's new one-shot and Kishimoto very much writing an independent story about how Minato created the Rasengan, it begins to make it look like maybe possibly Asura didn't create anything. But then again, fundamentally, the Rasengan and Asura's technique operate very differently. And also, there's over 2,000 years between their two lives. And since nobody was running around using Asura's bubble Rasengan technique, who's to say that Minato didn't create the Rasengan? Let's say hypothetically somebody in China about 5,000 years ago created the concept of the shovel. But 2,000 years after that, somebody in South America created the concept of the shovel without obviously ever going to China. Since neither culture has a concept of each other or what they've created, who's to say who really created the shovel? Sure, obviously somebody did it first, but being the first person to do it in your immediate vicinity without any outside help also definitely makes you an inventor. But at the very least, the two people who created these shovels would be linked by the fact that they both thought of something very similar. And whether or not we believe that Asura was actually using a bubble Rasengan technique, the fact that Minato and Asura, who was the progenitor of all of the Senju and Uzumaki, used a technique that was so similar to each other, gives credence to our theory. As Minato, who hails from a no-name clan, has mastered Uzumaki Fuinjutsu, the Rasengan, which may or may not have been created by Asura, and Flying Thunder God, which was very much created by his possible grandfather. And that's all he used, a complete Senju slash Uzumaki kit, which makes it seem a whole lot like the Namikaze name might just be hiding something. But what do you guys think? Do you believe that Minato could have been Tobirama's grandson? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Say bye to the people, Wagyu. Bye. He's trying to